Why does Mrs. Puff hate SpongeBob? Mrs. Puff's job is to teach students how to drive. But when it comes to SpongeBob, it's obvious she's completely lost hope. She doesn't just seem annoyed, she genuinely hates him.
I think it's safe to say you have once again failed your driving test.
But Mrs. Puff...
No buts, SpongeBob. You fail this test over and over. I'm beginning to believe you're simply unteachable.
Every time he walks into class, she looks like she's already bracing for disaster. Every time he gets behind the wheel, she's full-on panicking. And every time he fails, she's the one who ends up paying the price. But why? What did SpongeBob even do to make his own teacher despise him so much? Let's break it down and figure out the real reason Mrs. Puff can't stand SpongeBob. Part 1. Mrs. Puff's never-ending nightmare. The main reason Mrs. Puff can't stand SpongeBob is pretty straightforward. He's turned her life into a total nightmare. Every single time he shows up to class, chaos follows. Sure, most students have a hard time with boating at first, but SpongeBob is in a league of his own when it comes to being terrible. No matter how many lessons he takes or how many techniques he tries, he always messes up. And not just in small ways, but in the most over-the-top, disastrous ways possible. It's like he's cursed when it comes to driving, and Mrs. Puff is the one who has to deal with the fallout every single time. A perfect example of this is in boating school, where Mrs. Puff gives SpongeBob clear instructions, but his overthinking causes him to lose control and destroy everything in sight. At first she tries to be patient, but as SpongeBob continues to fail, you can see her hope slipping away.
What's the first thing you do?
Start the boat.
Mrs. Puff! Mrs. Puff!
Whoa! What?
It's okay.
It gets even worse in No Free Rides, where Mrs. Puff is so desperate to get rid of SpongeBob that she forges his boating license. She knows he's not ready, but at this point, she'd rather risk the safety of the entire city than have him in her classroom one more day. Do you think you would do the same? Subscribe if you said yes. Then there's Doing Time, where Mrs. Puff is sent to jail because of SpongeBob's reckless driving. This episode really shows how much she blames him for her suffering. She ends up behind bars, completely miserable, and when she realizes SpongeBob is visiting her, she loses it. Instead of seeing SpongeBob as just an annoying student, she sees him as a punishment she can't escape from. And that's really the core of Mrs. Puff's hatred. SpongeBob isn't just a bad student, he's the worst student she's ever had. He's caused her physical pain, mental exhaustion, and even legal trouble. Every time she gets a chance to live a normal life, SpongeBob finds a way to ruin it. Remember this, we will need it later. Part 2. The emotional toll of teaching SpongeBob. At first, Mrs. Puff tries to be professional. She knows SpongeBob isn't great at boating, but she still tries to help him. However, over time, it becomes clear that SpongeBob is unteachable. He doesn't improve, he doesn't learn from his mistakes. Instead, he keeps making things worse, and that slowly breaks Mrs. Puff. In Bumper to Bumper, Mrs. Puff realizes that SpongeBob physically cannot pass his test. No matter what she does, something always goes wrong. She's so defeated that she actually starts hallucinating about him while trying to teach other students. Then there's Demolition Doofus, the episode where Mrs. Puff finally snaps. After years of pain, accidents, and stress, she reaches her breaking point and actually tries to get rid of SpongeBob permanently. She enters him into a demolition derby, hoping he'll finally destroy himself. Of course, things don't go as planned, but this episode proves that her hatred for SpongeBob isn't just frustration anymore, it's turned into desperation.
Mrs. Puff, it's you! And you're all puffy again. Now everything's back to normal.
Yes, perfectly normal.
But what makes it even worse is that Mrs. Puff knows she can't escape. In multiple episodes, she's tried different methods to get rid of SpongeBob, whether it's giving him his license illegally, running away, or even changing her identity. But it never works. SpongeBob always finds a way back to her, no matter what she does. At this point, it's clear. Mrs. Puff doesn't just hate SpongeBob because he's bad at driving. She hates him because he's ruined her life, and no matter what she tries, she can't escape him. Part 3. Why can't SpongeBob just pass? If Mrs. Puff's entire job is teaching students how to drive, then why can't she just pass SpongeBob and move on? Why does he always fail? Well, the show actually gives us a few clues. One of the biggest reasons is revealed in Mrs. Puff, You're Fired. When a strict new instructor takes over SpongeBob's lessons, he actually starts driving perfectly. This suggests that Mrs. Puff might be part of the problem. She's been so traumatized by SpongeBob's failures that she expects him to fail, and that anxiety makes things worse.
Left turn at pedal number 143. Kick with the ball. Nice boy.
Nice driving. Now parallel park up ahead. Very good. Now, boy, the time has come to show Mr. Fitz what you learned.
Yes, sir. Step 1, seatbelts.
Excellent work, cadet.
Another theory comes from Boating Buddies, where SpongeBob reveals that he's never failed a test before, except for boating school. This is really interesting because it shows that SpongeBob can learn new skills.
What am I supposed to do?
You do the same thing that everybody else does who fails the test. You take it again next week.
Next week?
Don't worry, Squidward. I've never gotten one answer right on this test. But we'll meet again next week at Mrs. Puff's boating school.
So why does he struggle so much with boating? One explanation is that SpongeBob just wants to please Mrs. Puff so badly that he overthinks every little instruction, turning his natural confidence into complete panic. He tries so hard to get things right that he ends up messing up every time. Remember when I said we would need this later? This is why the cycle never ends. SpongeBob's desperation to succeed makes him nervous. His nervousness leads to failure, and his failure keeps Mrs. Puff trapped in her personal nightmare. Final thoughts. Will Mrs. Puff ever escape? Mrs. Puff's hatred for SpongeBob isn't just about annoyance, it's deep, personal, and exhausting. He's wrecked her classroom, destroyed her mental health, and even gotten her arrested. Every time she thinks she's free, SpongeBob finds a way to pull her back in. And the worst part? She knows it's never going to stop. At this point, it's hard to say if Mrs. Puff will ever escape SpongeBob. The show makes it clear that she's stuck in this cycle forever. But one thing is for sure, she's not just an angry teacher, she's a victim of Bikini Bottom's worst driver, and she knows it. So what do you think? Will Mrs. Puff ever get rid of SpongeBob, or is she doomed to suffer forever? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like these. And I will see you guys next time.